Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. America has a unique two-party political system. Does it still work? In 1996, beyond the Republican and Democratic nominees, we may see one more or two more or even three more serious presidential candidates who say it's time for something new. Joining us to discuss the matter are Michael Barone, author of Our Country, The Shaping of America from Roosevelt to Reagan, co-author of the Almanac of American Politics, and senior writer at U.S. News and World Report. Ronald Walters, chairman of the Political Science Department at Howard University and author of Black Presidential Politics in America, A Strategic Approach, and deputy campaign manager for issues in Jesse Jackson's 1984 campaign. Michael Beschloss, author of The Crisis Years, Kennedy and Khrushchev, 1960-1963, and Michael Vlahos, senior fellow at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. The topic before this House are two parties enough? This week on Think Tank. America is the only advanced democracy with a straight two-party system. Advocates say it helps unite a vast continental nation. But more often than you might think, third candidates and sometimes even fourth candidates have had a major influence on American presidential elections. The presidential election of 1860 had four major candidates. Abraham Lincoln was elected, becoming the first Republican president. In 1912, former Republican President Theodore Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate, finished second, and split the Republican vote. This allowed Democrat Woodrow Wilson to capture the White House. In 1968, presidential candidate Richard Nixon nearly lost the election to Democrat Hubert Humphrey because the governor from Alabama, George Wallace, took almost 14% of the vote, most of which would have gone to Nixon.
Got some folks out here who know a lot of four-letter words, but there are two four-letter words they don't know. W-O-R-K and S-O-A-P. You don't know those two-letter words, I'll tell you that much.
And in 1992, billionaire Ross Perot ran a chaotic but remarkably successful third-party campaign. To the surprise of many experts, Perot received almost a fifth of the vote. Perot may well run again in 1996, and he may not be alone. There is intense speculation that retired General Colin Powell could run as an independent. The Reverend Jesse Jackson has publicly discussed bolting the Democratic Party to run on an independent ticket. What their candidacies would mean for the Republicans or for the Democrats or for America is anyone's guess. We are going to talk in a moment about the current situation, but let's start first with a lesson in theory. What is the political theory behind our unique two-party American system? Michael Barone, and then let's go around the group.
Well, I think the argument for third parties is that the two major parties, we've got the two of the three longest running major parties in democratic societies in the world, have their own fixed kind of character and personality. They don't exhaust all political possibilities of what people may want, so you should have room for something else. The real argument, I think, against the third parties is that our electoral system works powerfully against third parties, the Electoral College and for the presidency and the single-member district in Congress. And as a practical matter, third parties have not proved lasting.
Okay. Michael Beschloss.
Third parties tend to address issues that oftentimes the major two parties do not address because they have to be these great umbrella majorities, and oftentimes they've gotten candidates to focus. In 1992, if Ross Perot had not been so tough on reducing the deficit, I think Bill Clinton and George Bush would not have tried to outbid him. At the same time, during a period in which this country is getting more fragmented than ever, in a way, the two umbrella parties seem a lot more welcome because there are very few unifying factors in the society.
Michael
Third parties are important in American history because the national third party, as opposed to a regional third party, emerges in a time of a conflict of visions over the American idea. A conflict
visions?
Yeah, a conflict that's deep-rooted, that's powerful. We had them in the Civil War, right before the Civil War, 1896, 1930s. The third party is a transitional device for Americans to play out this conflict of visions. What happens often is that it serves as a way of getting things defined so that it comes to terms in a critical election where one of these visions predominates. And at that point, once you have one vision triumph, those who are opposed to that vision still or who believe differently tend to take the opposition side, and you go back to two parties again.
All right. Ron Walters.
Very complex. I think the philosophical cement which has held the two-party system together really is fraying at the edges, and largely because I think when you look at the grand coalitions which have held these two parties together, the social interests behind them are coming unstuck. And I think that you look for the answers to that, not in the political system, but in the social system. And I think when we look at the fact that there's far less unity about the great ideas of this time, I think it's natural that you will see that reflected in the political system.
Why is it that America alone of the modern industrial democracies has a straight two-party system, and I guess everywhere else they are more fragmented parties?
Well, one quick answer is the Electoral College. I mean, the fact is you either carry all of a state's electoral votes or none, and the first one in there does.
So there's a constitutional root to it.
It doesn't help out very much if you're running a strong third. You get 0 in the Electoral College. If you're running even second, you get 0 in the Electoral College in those states.
If you run a third party, you can get a state's electoral votes with only 34% of the vote.
But in fact, what's happened is that there is residual loyalties typically to the two major parties, about which people at different points in our history have had really passionate attachments to, tend to make it hard for it. I mean, we saw Ross Perot in 1992 was running first out of 3 in the polls in the spring. If he hadn't withdrawn from the race, perhaps he would have been a contender. It's not impossible, but it's a hard threshold.
But there is a cultural reason for having two parties, and that is that unlike the other cultures of Europe and Japan, America isn't the same kind of structured class society where you have a dominant upper class that organizes society, and that class can structure its political system in ways where it's less central to how you define your identity. Whereas here, in some ways, the political system is the way in which we structure a sense of elite leadership in society and ratify it in ways that work for us. The ratification of authority in European states does not depend upon their electoral system as much.
Well, I was going to say something, just I think the opposite of that, because because I think that there is a sense really of class in a lot of this.
Well, I'm not saying there's a sense of class.
Well, okay,
but it isn't as structured as Europe.
But let me define it my way. I think that one of the ways in which the political parties, especially in the 20th century, emerged was predominantly out of the question of class. When you look at the way the Democratic Party has tended to mirror the development of industrial society, you can see then the root of that party system and for the way in which it served blue-collar interests. By the same token, in the 20th century, you look at the emergence of the Republican Party and the way in which it tended to serve the interests of those who own capital. And I think that what's happened, I think, in the post-World War II period is that division has broken down as we move toward a service economy. Two guys live in the suburbs. One works for IBM, the other for AT&T. They're Democrat, Republican. They wonder, what's the difference between us anymore?
I think another thing, if I might come in, is that especially on the Democratic side, in recent years, you see something of a lack of political courage of the kind that you used to see in the 19th century. By that I mean that Democrats in recent years who would like to be old liberal Democrats with a kind of view about activist, perhaps central government, that was the case, that was very popular in the 1930s, now people say Americans have turned away from that, but we still want to win, so we'll try to fuzz that up and paper over the division in the Democratic Party. And the result of that has been that every presidential candidate in the Democratic Party for about the last 10 to 15 years has been a hostage of this effort to paper over that conflict. And what you might see in 1996 is Bill Clinton once again trying to be both old and new Democrat, and you might see, if Jesse Jackson runs, Jackson forcing Clinton to choose one or the other, and essentially a third party doing what it's done through most of our history.
You don't really think that President Clinton would try to have two faces on an issue, do you?
I think he would. I'm not sure he want to limit himself to that. But no, he's an adaptive, and in a sense, he's almost a prototype of a nature, the character of the Democratic Party, because through its long history going back to the 1830s, the Democratic Party has typically been a collection outgroups, of people who sense or are sensed by others to be somehow not quite fully American or hyphenated American or a little different. It was the Irish as it started in the 1830s, Southerners as opposed to Northerners, factory workers, union members in the 1930s, black Americans, particularly after the New Deal and the Civil Rights Revolution. And at its best, the Democratic Party becomes sort of the quintessential American majority institution when it gathers enough of these groups together and can keep them together. But it's hard keeping all these groups together.
Well, it worked in the industrial period, but the problem is we're entering into a different era in terms of how our economy is structured. And you add to that the fact that the establishments of both the two parties don't speak to the people anymore. They're elitist establishments. And in fact, the cleavages in both parties illustrate the fact that you have the old lines of ideological separation and party allegiance shifting like this. So you now see libertarian Democrats, old hippies from the 60s, making common alliance with the Gingrich types who want to have the same kind of libertarian approach that fits the economic changes that are going on.
Republicans?
Well, in fact, the old class lines, we're still wearing the kind of attire that fits the old line elites. In fact, that's really breaking down, and that's traditionally...
You can take your tie off.
I might loosen it a little. No, but traditionally you have this breaking down of elites when you have an economic revolution.
Let me throw something else in, because we've been talking about interest, and that is, I think, technology has helped this process, because it's given groups the ability to project their interest into the political system without regard to the overarching structures of the party. Political scientists, for example, we talk a lot about why the party has gone, to hell. Well, the fact is that the party used to be the main instrument of political socialization, the main instrument of political information as a part of that. But today, somebody can turn on their television set and get more political information, or use some other means, internet, whatever have you. So that ability of groups to get together and to project their interests, to represent their interests, is another reason why I think you're fragmenting the political party system at the base.
Let's move now to the current situation, because when Ross Perot ran last time in 1992, he made the case, and I thought it was a pretty interesting case, that wouldn't it be nice to have a nonpartisan president who was neither a Democrat nor a Republican, who could take the best from each, who didn't get elected because this bloc or this special interest had given him money, and that he could sit there and be sort of the nonpartisan guy who got under the hood and fixed things. Is that, and now how does that play out in turn? Now let's turn to 1995.
The state law won't allow it. Right now, when you look at the way in which the Congress is produced, and the way in which people have to run through a gauntlet of state laws, which are really structured to favor the two-party system.
In congressional elections.
In congressional elections. Right now, I don't see any room in state law for a totally nonpartisan result. And I think that's going to be the problem. But I will say this, that as far as the presidential level is concerned, since the time of John Anderson, I think that what's happened in states is that it's become easier and easier for serious third-party candidates to gain ballot access. And the technicalities around ballot access really have stymied a lot of great
So what's the latest a candidate can get in the race, Ron, and get ballot access in all the states, do you think?
I think about now.
Perot didn't start till the spring of the election year.
Well, in many states you have petition requirements. And those petition requirements means that you have to get 30, 40, 50,000, some 100,000.
That's right. And
some crazy number of petitions.
Out, yeah.
That's right. And you have to get them validated, and they have to be ready for some of the elections that are occurring this year in order to use that ballot access for next year.
Is Jesse Jackson, in your judgment, going to do that?
I plead the fifth on that question.
Has he taken some of the beginning steps in that, or have others done that?
No, he's talked about it seriously, but I would say this. When you look at a combination of groups that have already run, from Peace and Freedom Party to Ron Daniels and many others, that have already created ballot access in many states, I don't think he would have to start over, new. Yeah. He could use, in fact, some of the lines that have already been created.
The only time that national third parties are really important and can be really important, and this isn't just a function of local laws, is when one of the two major parties begins to break up. And we have serious enough divisions in both parties, especially the Democrat Party, where you could begin to see that. If you have a situation where people feel so unattached to a party, the prospect of a third party that 2 or 3 years ago might have just been based around a charismatic figure like Ross Perot now becomes something that they begin to focus on. That's what you had in the 1850s. But that reflects
Democratic
deep
Party
divisions.
breaking up, anybody?
I guess I see it very differently, because what third parties have done, certainly in this century, you see something like the split that Ben mentioned, 1912, between Theodore Roosevelt and William
Well, that was
Howard
an
Taft in the
anomaly, though.
Republican Party.
Yeah.
That was mended again. Same thing in 1948. There was a suggestion that the Democratic Party would break up because you had splinters on the left and right. They came back again. 1968, George Wallace took a number of people out. I think what it tends to do is not so much always cause a party to break up, although that certainly did happen in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, but what it does is it gets a party to focus. What I would suggest in this time, one problem of the Democratic Party at the presidential level during the last 2 decades has been lack of focus. Do the Democrats believe in the idea of strong activist government, or is this something that they're walking away from? In 1980, that was papered over. Very much the same thing now. So if you had a party such as a Jesse Jackson party splintering from the Democrats, what it could cause is a much more focused Democratic Party.
If I could just rephrase that, I mean, the point is that the development of the Know-Nothings followed the collapse of the Whigs. What I'm saying is, if one of the two major parties that's been hallowed around a long time loses a lot of its adherents and becomes a kind of rump party like the Whigs did, then you see that as a consequence of a divide in which the issue has left its former place. It's left the party. It's gone somewhere else.
Sure, it's kind of a hard drill, though, to do this. One of the things we see in presidential races recently has been that you do better, as Ross Perot showed, if you're some kind of a celebrity coming forward.
All right,
Ross Perot.
Let me ask you a question. Speaking of celebrities, suppose you had General Colin Powell,
The man
former
we've not
chairman.
mentioned.
That's right, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, running on a ticket, on a visionary ticket, as an independent with traditional values as his major theme.
Well, I think that.
How would he do?
I think there's a real potential for that candidacy. You know, you can see it in the polls, and you can see it depending on what General Powell does. In a way, a presidency of this sort is almost what the founders envisaged. They did not think the president would be a partisan figure. The person they had in mind for the first holder of that office, George Washington, tried very much to hold himself above party, although that became difficult in his administration.
Yes. But the problem is that so many people in the elite are looking to Powell to kind of paper over and bring together a cleavage in America that you can't get away from.
Your example of the Whigs earlier, the Whig Party disappeared in part because it refused to confront or take a stand on the moral issue of the day, slavery, an extension of slavery. They said, hey, we're neutral on this, and everybody else had strong feelings about it. They said, we don't need a party that's neutral on this. We'll go with the Democrats who like slavery, or we'll go with the Republicans that sort of dislike it.
That's beginning to happen now.
This is the David Dinkins solution. Paper it over, hope that he can bring everybody
David Dinkins,
together.
the mayor of
the mayor of New
former
York.
mayor of New
former
York.
mayor of
I
New York
agree
City.
with you on
And
that.
it
We
didn't
spoke
work.
about the great mosaic and what
This isn't
And that's
the
right,
same
and it
as
didn't work.
Eisenhower either. This isn't the same as Eisenhower because that was
But let me say
America.
something about
Sorry,
Colin
yeah.
Powell. I
Right.
just wanted to just go just a little step further on Colin Powell, because I think that the minute he opens his mouth and begins to articulate his vision, the white population, which now in the polls shows him way up there, is going to splinter. So he's going to carry, I think, some of the white population. But I think the real damage is going to be done to the Democratic Party. He probably will carry as much as 1/3 of people who consider themselves Democrats, and that's going to be the death knell.
Would he capture a
of the
majority of
Democratic
the black vote if
No,
he ran?
about a third
significant,
of the black
I
vote.
would say about a third of the black vote, people who now call themselves
Now,
Democrats.
Michael Beschloss, you tell me, how would Colin Powell do?
I think he might win the election. I think it would be a very problematical presidency. We've been talking about third parties and third party candidates. If he runs, he would not particularly be the candidate of a party. He would be an independent movement, no base in Congress. If Colin Powell were elected on the basis of personality and his very considerable prestige, what could he really claim this election as a mandate for? One advantage of having a Republican or Democratic label at this point in time is that at the very least a Bill Clinton can say in 1992, whether genuinely or not, my election represents a mandate for a point of view on a number of issues, and I'm going to use that in dealing with Congress and the American people. Very hard for Colin Powell to do that if he runs a campaign that is as much above ideology as we're talking about.
I disagree, because mandates are not given. Politicians create mandates out of victory. Look at Lowell Weicker in Connecticut. Here's a guy who ran on something called the Connecticut Party and won, and right away claimed a mandate for doing what?
He's hated by so many
Raising
Americans.
taxes.
Raising taxes. Well, that's, he said he'd consider raising taxes before.
Consider this is the problem with Colin Powell,
That's right.
though. He'd grab the basically uncommitted middle, and hanging out there on both ends would be the firebrands who want to change America in two different directions. And so the problem would just be postponed.
He's basically, we have a sort of polarized politics in this country, in part because we've got a polarized people. I mean, the force in the Republican Party with the most elan and energy right now seems to be the religious right.
Well,
in the Democratic
right,
Party,
yeah.
I would say it's the feminist left.
Right.
Has been, certainly in 1992, was the part of the party with energy and enthusiasm and so forth. Neither one of those groups is sure that General Powell shares their basic vision. And when a person comes forward as he does, who's widely admired but whose views aren't known, any enunciation of his views are going to subtract some people from supporting him who otherwise would have done so. In a cultural split, it'll be interesting. I mean, you're basically writing a platform for him, Ben, that I don't know if General Powell agrees with or not.
I'm writing a book about that platform for a number of candidates, for about one book for 4 or 5 candidates. That's of different parties.
One of the problems I see here, and this highlights my belief that this is a period of a conflict of visions, is that the two opposing visions are hell-bent on demonizing each other. The kind of demonizing you haven't seen since the 1850s, when the Republicans talked about the slave power and characterized, the Southerners as evil, and the Southerners turned around and did the same thing.
We are running out of time. Let's go around once more this way, and let me ask one simple question to which I would like, again, a short answer, although it's hard to do. In terms of the next presidential election, given the fact that none of us know the future, so stipulated, will there be a third party candidate or a fourth party candidate or a third independent candidate, fourth? And how is this thing going to play out? Stipulated that none of us really knows. Ron Walters, Howard University.
I think that there will be a third party candidate. It's hard now to see who actually is going to lose. I think Perot makes the Republicans lose. There could be the emergence of a Jesse Jackson and Colin Powell to make the Democrats lose. The fact is that the polls are showing that 47% or 50% of blacks think it's time for a black party, so that they may not stay with the Democratic Party if Clinton doesn't do right over issues like affirmative action. So I think there will be one. It's hard to say right now what the configuration will be.
Michael Vlahos, Progress and Freedom Foundation.
You'll have splits in both parties. They may look minor in terms of challenges to the two parties, but you're going to see an erosion of the old parties and the emergence of two new parties that better reflect the actual issue at hand in terms of a conflict of visions in America.
2 new parties.
Well, the parties will reshape themselves.
Okay.
They may be called different names, but you need to have parties today that attach themselves to the two visions that are driving America toward whatever future it has.
And just very briefly, what are the 2 visions? 1, 2.
Well, one vision is basically a paternalistic, multicultural vision of a balkanized America run by a dominant elite. The other vision is a much more fragmented, libertarian, cum traditional values vision.
Okay. You have Michael Beschloss. Tell us the future, distinguished historian.
To govern is to choose, and third parties help major parties, Republicans and Democrats, to choose. Republicans are a majority party right now. The Democrats are the ones who are going to have to decide what they want to do in the future. They have really eluded that question. If there is a breakout from the Democrats, they're going to have to choose one way or the other, left or right.
Michael Barone, surely you know the future.
Surely I know the future. I do not know the future. I have a hard time knowing the past. I will say there's about a 40% chance that we will see a serious third candidacy. It will depend on whether General Colin Powell thinks the Republican candidate nominee is up to snuff. It will depend on whether Jesse Jackson believes that the Clinton administration policy is unacceptable. And it will depend on whatever Ross Perot's decision-making process depends on.
Okay, I know the future, but I'm not going to reveal it right now. Thank you, Michael Barone, Ronald Walters, Michael Beschloss, and Michael Vlahos. And thank you. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.